Oh, I swear my Bobbit costume's up here somewhere. Huh? Whoa. It's beautiful.
Oh, hello, little fella. I didn't see you right there. Do you think you could beat the Tippi Troll at some Tippi Tree?
Bring it, you stinky troll. I invented this game.
Yeah. This one's for you, Dad.
All right, so it's not your first game then. No problem. How about a cliffhanger?
Think you fancy, huh? Watch this.
Pillar move. So you're one of those players, huh? No problem. All right, I guess it's time for the inverted lock.
Impossible! This can't be!
I guess I'll win then.
Yeah, I guess so.
All right, well, do I get to go home now?
Yeah, you just go around the corner.
Okay, see ya, dude.
See ya.
Well, that was interesting. Welcome to Make Anything, I'm Devin, and by now I've already shared many different versions of my original 3D printed stacking game, Tippi Tree. Here we've got the original classic version of the game, and we've also got some fun skins like this leaky hydrant, and of course, the Tiki Tree. There's also this cute little half-scale version, as well as this big double-scale Tippi Tree, which is really cool, although to be honest, this tree just left me yearning for an even bigger Tippi Tree. I wanted a giant backyard-sized version of Tippi Tree, but even with this double-scale version, it was taking a lot of time and material to print these leaves. So to make one that's twice this size, I figured, why not go all out and use what some consider the gold of nature? Lumber. Oh yeah, today we're building a giant Tippi Tree. And, well, some things worked, other things didn't. So let's take a look at what it took to build the world's largest Tippi Tree. Cool. So, here's our standard Tippi Tree leaf. And while the overall shape seems pretty weird, I realized that it could be broken up into 6 rectangular blocks, with just 2 different dimensions. And despite lumber prices, I actually found wood to be a relatively cost and time-efficient material for this endeavor. That's because I chose to use these cheap 2x2 furring strip boards that are sold at most home improvement stores. I managed to get 22 of these 8-foot strips for just $100, which is a pretty sweet deal. Though even after sorting through every strip in the store, some were not as straight as others, and the quality of each strip can definitely vary. but for this first attempt, I think it's a good choice. Here in Fusion 360, I mocked up my giant leaf by simply scaling up my original design 400%, so each strip now has an edge length of 40 millimeters. Now, these 2x2 strips are actually closer to 38 millimeters on each side, but I wanted to account for the imperfect nature of wood, so I assumed that they were slightly larger when I was designing my jig. Besides being a fun little dance, a jig is also a term for a specially designed template that helps out in the construction process. For the giant leaves, I created this jig I call the Tippi Tray. The way it works is that this bottom tray holds the first 3 blocks of wood, and then the second tray stacks on top and helps align the remaining 3 pieces until everything's fastened in place. Unsurprisingly, I used 3D printing to help bring my Tippi Tray to life, printing both the top and bottom parts on my CR10 Max. I also printed these quick guides on the Anycubic Mega X to help measure out the lengths of my wooden pieces. So I got to work, first cutting my boards in half on the table saw, just so they're a bit easier to work with. Then I taped this popsicle stick to the sled so I can find out exactly where that blade is cutting. From that cut, I'll use my guide to mark the precise length of my first pieces, and then I can clamp down this block to act as a stop. Now I can quickly make multiple cuts, and as long as the board is against that stop, every piece should come out the same size. So I cut a few of the small blocks, and then some of the longer ones. Just enough to make my first test pieces. A quick sand, and it's time to try out my jig. I decided to use both wood glue and then some 2.5-inch finish nails so that the parts would instantly hold together and then get super strong when that glue dries. I figured 2 nails in each joint should be enough, and okay. Turns out, just because it's a 2.5-inch nailer doesn't mean it's holding 2.5-inch nails. So I swapped in the correct nails and tried again. Much better. Well, except for the fact that my long pieces were too short. Somehow I was silly enough to tape my popsicle stick entirely above the blade height and went to set my stop based on that incorrect marker. No, Devin, not okay. Nevertheless, I already had these pieces cut out, so I finished my test leaves to try out the general fit, and the results were mixed. Some orientations fit a bit too tight, while others are really loose, and I guess that's the result of my jig assuming that the pieces were 40 millimeters wide, when they're really a bit smaller. I really didn't want to pause this project to print all new jigs and change all the measurements, so instead I figured out that I could get pretty successful leaves just by using some shims to push these blocks apart and this third one inward. Even then, there's quite a lot of variation with these cheap 2x2s, so every leaf was bound to be a little different. So onwards I pushed, cutting down all of my remaining wood into hundreds upon hundreds of blocks. From there, I started assembling a few more leaves after some light hand sanding, but I quickly realized that this was gonna take approximately forever. So instead, I decided to use this belt disc sander to clean up all the ends and chamfer all the edges while I was at it. Besides looking a bit nicer, this should also reduce the chances of chipping the corners and just make the whole game a little less pointy. That sanding machine was a huge time saver, but it's still a lot of work considering that I'm dealing with over 400 blocks of wood at this point. After sanding, I still had to deal with some of the bigger cracks and holes in this cheap wood, so I filled a fat syringe with wood glue and did my best to fill and glue down any areas of concern. I'll admit, I got a bit obsessive here and I kept filling smaller and smaller blemishes, but what can I say? This is my game. It's my child. After the glue dried, I sanded down any raised spots, and then I was finally ready to assemble the rest of my leaves. I was definitely getting a hang of assembly and managed to keep making better fitting leaves as I went along. And I think they already looked really nice in this state, but I wasn't quite done. I wanted a tree that pops, so I did a quick experiment with doing a color wash. I mixed equal parts interior paint and water and just wiped that onto my piece with a cotton rag. I was a bit worried about the water raising the wood grain and creating splinters, but it honestly worked out way better than I expected. So, without hesitation, I moved this operation outdoors and prepared myself a little painting space. I'm actually using the leftover paint from my giant numbers project, starting with my lightest yellow and working my way towards a red-orange for a nice fall color palette. As you can see, I just held the pieces over this 5-gallon bucket and slopped on that watered down paint so I could be pretty messy with it. This part actually wasn't so bad. I had a good system going and the sun was nice and bright, drying out the leaves in minutes. And since I was going from yellow to orange, I just kept adding darker paint to my wash and ended up with a really pleasant gradient. Aw yeah! Now these are some giant Tippi Tree leaves. I won't lie, it was a ton of work to make such a huge batch of giant parts like this. I think it took 9 days of hard labor just to get to this point. But at the same time, I was getting more excited and motivated as I went along, so that's always a good feeling. Still, at this point, there was one big part missing from our giant Tippi tree. And that's the tree. My original idea was to 3D print a giant mold and actually cast the entire trunk out of concrete. That would just look so cool. But as I did a bit more research, I became a bit concerned. Because well, the trunk would be super heavy. Even if I hollowed it out and made it just 3 feet tall, it would probably come out over 150 pounds. And B, while concrete is really good at handling compressive strength, it's not necessarily as good at dealing with the kind of twisting forces that the Tippi leaves would be putting on the top part of that tree. So, for the time being, I decided I would go ahead and build the entire base out of wood as well. For the trunk, I'll be using 2x4 lumber, and I started by cutting 4 equal length pieces that will make the 4 faces of the trunk. I took those to the jointer, which is this magical tool that creates one perfectly flat surface. Then we can run those pieces through the planer to make the opposite surface parallel and flat as well. I ran my pieces through several times until they reached the exact width that I needed, and then I took them to the belt sander to clean up the edges, just like the leaves. Here you can see how the 4 pieces will come together. And the next step is to cut away some pockets to form the top of the trunk. Using a square, I marked out the entire cut on one of these pieces to make sure I got things right. And once again, we'll be using the table saw and sled to make a cut known as a rabbet. First, I adjusted the height of the blade to match what I wanted to cut away, and then I'll place a stop to limit the depth of that rabbet cut. I'll start out by just cutting away the very end of my piece like so, and then I'll move it down a tiny bit and cut away a bit more. We'll do that over and over again until my piece hits the end stop, and there's our rabbet. The cut is accurate, but kind of rough, so I'll use a sanding block to clean up and chamfer those edges as well. Once I've done that to all 4 sides, we can assemble the trunk piece by piece. So I applied wood glue and then squared up and clamped 2 of the pieces in place and used that pneumatic nailer again to really hold them together. The 3rd face is pretty much added the same way, and the 4th just requires 2 sides to be glued up at once, but it was pretty painless and the result is a really nice and hefty trunk. But to make this thing totally sturdy, we still need a solid base. And luckily, my dad had these beefy 4x4 posts to donate, so I used the chop saw to cut each of those in half to make the 4 legs of my base. I cleaned those up on the sander and arranged my legs around the tree. Or I guess they're roots. Anyways, I trusted this design and started gluing these roots together. Now, these parts were clearly going to need more than nails, so I bought these 5-inch lag bolts, or at least they were all meant to be the same. Anyways, I laid out a plan for my bolts, hoping to fasten the roots to each other with 4 bolts, and then using 4 more to attach the trunk. I had to use my longest drill bits here to make the pilot holes for these big bolts. Unfortunately, my longest bits are also the most dull, so it took some force and a lot of patience, but I did get the job done. In fact, after only the first 4 bolts, the base was already really stable, and the trunk just press fits into place, which is actually better than I planned since I can easily disassemble the tree for transportation and storage. And with that, we finally have ourselves a full Tippi Tree. It just needs a bit of personality, and most importantly, some good company.
Stack anything on that. Okay. Whoa! He has to go home. You have to leave. Do it. Walk away. This must be Make Anything's girlfriend.
I've got to say, this giant Tippi Tree is a really fun spin on the tabletop version. The scale of it just makes the game super intense, and these wooden pieces have a really satisfying weight to them. What?
I didn't even touch it. It was already leaning forward.
Well, it turns out Giant Tippi Tree is really fun. And because the game is 4 times larger than the original, and maybe because of the texture of the wood as well, it's actually a bit easier to stack up a lot of leaves. So it's a good thing I made so many of these. That said, while these leaves generally held up, we did suffer a few casualties. I guess it isn't totally surprising that some pieces broke. In a game of Tippi Tree, there can be situations where a pile of 30 leaves is stacked on a single leaf. And what's crazy is that the wood glue actually held together, but the wood itself was breaking and yanking out those long nails. So for now, I'm just gonna repair these pieces as they break, using glue, nails, and these 2.5-inch screws from the opposite side, which should add quite some strength. I also went back and touched up areas where the leaves got chipped or dented, and that happened to a few of them as well. These repaired pieces have already gone through several more rounds of Tippi Tree, and fortunately, not one has broken again. But I'll have to keep you updated. Well, there's my adventure with the giant Tippi Tree so far, and I'm just thrilled that it not only works, but this version's really fun. The scale of this just brings a whole new level of excitement, so I hope that these parts hold up for quite some time. I'm probably gonna have to put screws through a lot more of the connection points, but if you have any suggestions for different techniques or different materials I could use to make an even bigger Tippi Tree, please share those thoughts in the comments. Also, let me know if you'd be interested in seeing a live stream or just some uninterrupted playthrough of Tippi Tree, because every round is kind of different and I think it would be fun to stream a tournament or just some casual gameplay. Anyways, that wraps it up for today's video. Thank you so much for making it all the way through. And as a reward, I am gonna give away the golden tiki totem to the first person who can leave a comment with the correct number of leaves that I built throughout this video. They do all appear on screen somewhere. So that's it for today. I'll put any relevant links in the description, but I'll see you next time, and until then, remember to stay inspired.